He sends his pure, sweet love, a sign from above, on the wings of a dove.
There are two truths we simply must know. The truth about God, our Maker and our Judge, and the truth about ourselves. Both truths are far removed from what our human imaginations would picture. The great Judge is pictured not only as the all-wise, but the all-good, the all-compassionate, the all-merciful, and yet altogether holy. He cannot endure sin. He must do away with sin, and all who willfully, knowingly, presumptuously cling to sin must be destroyed by the holiness of God. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a holy God. But it's that holy God who was crucified for our sakes, and who, holding his arms out in invitation at the cross, was saying, "Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. My hands are spiked for the wrong things your hands have done. My feet are nailed for the wrong places your feet have led you. My brow is crowned with thorns because of your wrong thoughts. My back is red with stripes because of the idols you have carried all your lives. Come, live and not die." And so the truth about God is that he's so much better than we ever dared to hope. The truth about us is that we're much worse than we ever suspected. The parables make this very clear indeed. The parables stress the great love of God, but also his holiness, and they warn against the two abuses of that holiness. One, what theologians call antinomianism, which means when we flagrantly, willfully, presumptuously do what we know to be wrong. The parables warn against that. But they also warn even more strongly against the easier, more common error of thinking we can by our goodness earn heaven. That's called legalism. They're both wrong. In our last study, we looked at the story about the legalistic vine owners. Stewards, really, they didn't own it. The real owner's God. All he asked for is the fruit of goodness. But they, despite their profession of religion, murder his emissaries one by one. And last of all, they murder his son. That's the story of the law, where God seems to be making demands. And the law puts emphasis on demands. But then in the next chapter, in Matthew 22, we have a story of the gospel about a feast. Not an ordinary meal, but a feast. Not an ordinary feast, but a king's feast. Not an ordinary king's feast, but a feast for the marriage of the king's son. We noted last time that God coming to dwell in humanity in the incarnation of Jesus is symbolised by the marriage that we know so well in human experience. A man and woman become one. God and humanity became one in Bethlehem. And the symbol of the gospel throughout the New Testament is not that of a fast or a funeral, but of a party. God promising us joy, love and laughter, fullness and fellowship. All these are expressed in the symbolism of a party. Let me read it to you in Matthew 22. "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a marriage feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the marriage feast, but they would not come. Again he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, behold, I've made ready my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves are killed. Everything's ready. Come to the marriage feast.' They made light of it, went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully, and killed them. And the king was angry, and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding's ready. Those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the thoroughfares. Invite to the marriage feast as many as you find.' And those servants went into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good, to the wedding, till the wedding hall was filled with guests." Let's think on that much of the story to start with. All things are now ready. Come. And he sends repeated messengers. Come. As if to say, I will be so sorry if your seat's empty. I have a place for you. Do come. I will miss you terribly if you don't come. Please come. He's not inviting them to a funeral. He's not inviting them to a hanging. They're not going to prison. They're coming to a party, a wonderful party. Even at the entrance they gave a great gift to you, a beautiful robe. It says they made light of it. How could that be true? Well, the Saviour's telling us about our own stupidity. The more people value things, usually the less valuable they are. And the things that are least valued by men and women are the most valued by heaven. Christ could say the things that you esteem down here are an abomination with God. So it says they made light of it. We do not readily see the value of spiritual things. We forget a lot of things. We forget that houses crumble. We forget that flesh rots. We forget that stars lose their fires. But ideals remain. And the judgment remains a solemn fact. And conscience remains. And Christ remains. It's those who do the will of God that will abide forever. They're the only ones that will remain. We need to ask ourselves often, where will I be in 100 years? First 20 years, the longest half of anybody's life. Perhaps most people listening to me are nearer to 8 o'clock at night or 9, the noonday of the day of their lives. For the first 20 years is the longest half of anybody's life. And we need to ask ourselves about the end of life. Where will we be in 100 years' time? We dare not make light of the gospel. It's the only thing that can take us over the abyss of death. He that hath the Son hath life. He that hath not the Son of God hath not life. He that believeth has everlasting life. He that believeth is not condemned. He who believes not is condemned already, and the wrath of God abides on him. I'm either under the mercy of God or I'm under the wrath of God. There's no neutrality. He that's not with me is against me. He that gathers not with me scatters abroad. They made light of it. Here's the folly of our age. See what interests most people. The races, the football, making money, sex. Some of these things have a grounding in the good gift of God. God invented sex, not the devil. But the devil has wonderfully perverted all of God's gifts. So they're used carelessly and selfishly and often dangerously. Our world has taken God's gifts and perverted them from A to Z, from top to bottom, from first to last. And the special things of the Spirit, they make light of it. And the excuses are listed in Luke 14. One says, well, I bought 5 yoke and oxen, I must go and test them. Another, I bought 5 acres of land, I must go and see it. Another, I've married a wife, so I cannot come. All excuses, none of them true. If he's bought the acres of land, they're not going to run away while he goes to the party. If he's born the oxen, it's too late now to change. He can try them later. And if he's married a wife, she's welcome. Bring her. So all the excuses are just that. They're just excuses. You notice there are 2 reactions. One lot just make light of it and nothing more, but another lot of people are very angry at the invitation. You'd never get angry at an invitation to a party from a king, but that's what happens here. Because the spiritual reality is that some people just ignore the gospel and others are made angry by it. A woman in Wesley's days, who was an aristocrat, said, you don't mean to tell me that my heart is as filthy and depraved as those ordinary people in the street outside? And Wesley said, yes, ma'am, that's exactly what I'm saying. There's no difference. And she was scandalised. So when it says in the story that some made light of it, but others were angry and seized the servants and treated them shamefully and killed them, that anticipates the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, the Jews hearing the gospel, they seize Peter and put him in prison, seize James, he's beheaded. They take other apostles and put them in the stocks. The book of Acts is a book of riots and revivals. Jesus went up, Spirit came down, the believers went out, the converts came in. This upset the devil very much. So there are always storms in the book of Acts. Shipwrecks, prison sentences, executions. All that's intimated here when it says that the rest seized his servants, treated them shamefully and killed them. We have more history here when it says the king was angry and he sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. The book of Acts ends about 64 AD. 6 years later, Jerusalem was destroyed and 1 million Jews died. That fulfilled that verse. Then he said to his servants, the wedding's ready, those invited weren't worthy. Go out. Go out now to the Gentiles. So the Jews have been sketched up to the point where their city is destroyed. Now the Gentiles. And the Gentiles respond. A mixed medley. Lame beggars jostling one another with their crutches. Blind beggars groping ravenously towards bounteous tables. Dumb beggars mumbling horribly their inarticulate delight. Walking lepers come, rank on rank, lurching bravos from the ditches dank. Vermin-eaten saints with mouldy breath, unwashed legions from the ways of death. But the marriage is filled, the seats are taken. Whosoever will's invited. And you'll notice that the guests are not the ones most privileged in life, they're the ones least privileged. The Gentiles had less religious privileges. The Gentiles were like the beggar Lazarus that was laid at the rich man's gate. The rich man was a figure of the Jews. The beggar was a symbol of the Gentiles. It's the needy that get the prize. You remember that wonderful story in 2 Kings chapter 7? A great city is besieged, the enemy is all out there, and a prophet says, don't worry, God will give you plenty to eat by tomorrow. And the people laugh and jeer at the prophet's message. And that night, God causes the besieging army to hear the noise of chariots. And they all take off. They say, the Israelites have hired the Egyptians against us. Let's go. And they all take off and leave the tents there. Candles burning, tables laden with food. And the city that's been besieged for so long, where they're feeding on garbage worth its weight in silver and gold, has 4 lepers outside of it. And the lepers say, well, they're not throwing us any more garbage. We're going to die. Let's go out to the enemy. And you remember what happened? In the twilight, the 4 lepers, near to death, knowing that the people inside the city are dying from hunger, the worst that can happen to them is to be decapitated by a sword. That's better than having an empty stomach all the time that's rumbling. So they creep out to the first line of the tents, and they raise the flap of the first tent, and lo and behold, the candles are burning, the table is loaded with food, and there's nobody there. So the lepers go in and ask the blessing, tuck in, then they dig a hole and put in all the gold and silver cutlery. They say, we wonder what's in the next tent. So they lift the flap, and they go there, and lo and behold, it's a repeat. The candles are burning, the table is loaded with goodies, and the lepers sit down again and ask the blessing and tuck in, and again they dig a hole and put in all the furniture. They repeat it at the third, and then conscience strikes them like an arrow to its target. And they say, we're not doing well. This is the day of the gospel. That's what the word is translated in the Septuagint. This is the day of good news. We must go and tell the people in the city. But when they go, the people don't believe them. Please note, it was the lepers that found the goodies. The great blessing of nothingness, the great invitation of emptiness, is the lesson we must learn. Until we're broken, we're useless. And God wanted to make a world, he started with chaos. If our world's reduced to chaos, we ought to throw our hats in the air and say, perhaps God is going to do a great thing. Until there's a sense of need, God can't feed us, God can't strengthen us, God can't bless us. The rich, he turns away. The full have no place at his table. So this wedding is furnished with guests. But please notice what follows in verse 11 of this same Matthew 22. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. He said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? He was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot, cast him into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. God called all Israel out of Egypt. Only a few got into the promised land. God called thousands to be Gideon's army. Only 300 were finally selected. God called 12 apostles. One of them, Judas, hung himself. Many are called, but few are chosen. Because few respond with heart and mind and soul. And the ones that are called but not chosen are represented here by the man who had no wedding garment. The wedding garment was a gift, but this man thought he was dressed well enough. He didn't need the gift. So he'd sat down at the tables, self-confident, that just as he was fine. It's not enough to be in church. It's not enough to read the Bible. It's not enough to talk about theological topics. It's not enough to be a preacher. It's only enough to have on the robe of the righteousness of Christ, the gift of his righteousness, which always has an impact upon us when we put it on and changes us, so that in the last great day, when God looks down, he sees that because of the gift, we've become like the giver in principle. We're never perfect in our fulfillment of things, for while the spirit is willing, the flesh is weak. But the only man or woman who will be saved will be the person who has become in their heart of hearts like God the great lover, like God the great giver. Now I want to turn to another story, also in this book, and I'm looking at Matthew 25. Then the kingdom of heaven shall be compared to 10 maidens who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with them. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. But at midnight a cry, behold, the bridegroom cometh. Come out to meet him. And all those maidens rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out. And the wise replied, there won't be enough for us and for you. You better go to the dealers, buy for yourselves. While they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast. And the door was shut. Afterwards the other maidens came also, saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. He replied, truly I say to you, I don't know you. Here's a story of church members, a virgin faith, their lights burning, they're not cavorting in evil, they're not at the casino, they're not at the races, they're not at the bar, they're religious people. And they have some truth. There's the light. But when the bridegroom comes, only 5 have lamps that have kept burning with plenty of oil. They had an extra supply. 5 of them were super confident. They didn't bother. The 5 foolish virgins represent people who take a certain measure of delight in religion, a certain measure of delight in the gospel, but they do not let their light so shine among men that men may glorify God because of their good works. The 5 virgins represent those who, like the seed that fell in rocky places, sprang up quickly but had no root. I repeat what I said earlier, it's nothing to join the club for eternal life, nothing, it's free. But the annual subscription is everything we've got, because we're not our own, because we acknowledge that all we have or are or ever hope to be are his. So a true Christian is someone that is wholehearted for Christ. Holiness is wholeness. It's an intense concentration on the viewpoint of God about everything. Anything less is unchristian. The supreme question that faces me when I first wake up in the morning and every hour during the day is, what would God want me to do? That's holiness. These virgins have a profession, they have some theological truth, they love church, they love hymns, they give offerings, but they're partial Christians and they're shut out. Notice the story that follows. That's about the church waiting. Now we read about the church working. Verse 14. When a man going on a journey called his servants and trusted them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made another 5. Also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. And after a long time, the master of those servants comes to settle accounts. And he who had received the 5 talents sprang forward, bringing the 5 talents, saying, Master, you gave me 5, I've got 5 more. The master said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Same story with him that has 2 talents. But then the one who had 1 came forward. Master, I knew you to be a very hard man, reaping where you didn't sow, gathering where you didn't winnow. I was afraid. I went and hid your talent. Here you've got what's yours. His master answered him, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I haven't sowed and gather where I haven't winnowed. You ought to have invested my money. At my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. Take the talent from him. Give it to him who has 10. To everyone who has will more be given. He'll have abundance. From him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. There men will weep and gnash their teeth. We've noticed in the parables the stress on grace. The workers of the vineyard, those that come in the 11th hour, get the whole lot. They haven't earned it. We've noticed in the wedding supper, men are given the wedding garment when they come. We notice that the prostitute who anoints Christ's feet is told, go into peace. Your sins be forgiven you. Here's grace. But the same parables tell us that when we receive grace, we must be gracious. And so God expects fruit from the vineyard workers. He expects the man without the wedding garment to have taken the garment and come underneath, somewhat like all the garment symbolised about the giver. He expects that the virgins won't just have enough oil to make a religious profession, but they'll have extra oil, the oil of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, temperance, these things. They didn't have them. That was the church waiting. Now here's the church working. And while the maidens who were foolish were overconfident, here's a man in this story who's underconfident. And all his troubles grow out of the fact he has a wrong view of God. Can I say it with some emphasis that the root of all our troubles is a wrong view of God? Because if we knew God as he is, he'd be hard to resist. The Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. To know God as he is hard to resist. The root of all evil comes in a wrong view of God. The devil's name is slanderer. And he slandered God to men. We somehow think that we have a little kindness and little patience and little sympathy, but not God. But all we've got is a tiny skerrick, a very dim reflection of one partial, infinitesimal ray of his goodness, his kindness. This man sinned because he had a wrong view of God. He thought God was a hard man. God has the softest heart in the universe. He thought God was unmerciful. God's the most merciful being in the universe. We invite great disaster if we do not early learn the truth about the goodness of God. And we learn that best in the person of Christ, and we see that most clearly at the cross of Calvary, where he can pray for his murderers and say, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Where he can say to a man who'd just been cursing him a little while before, cheer up, you're going to be in paradise with me. I tell you that this sad, dark day, you'll be in paradise with me. To live right, we must know aright the character of God. To know the character of God, we must look clearly at Jesus. To see Jesus at his clearest, we must observe Calvary. There we see love and mercy intertwined with holiness, and of all of it bending toward the sinner, saying, I love you, come, and paradise is yours.